Okay. Thank you very much, Mas Awi. Can we do the presentations? Is there any? My presentations? Have you? I've sent it to Desi already. Okay, then I think I will start the discussions first without any presentation if there is any. So thank you very much. I will do my best in 7 minutes because this is a very 10 minutes is okay. It was a leave when you say 15 minutes, but then the organizer mentions 10 minutes, and I will be in fast again. So my presentations today actually talking about not dramatizing again or reminiscing again the exploitations occur experienced by our migrant fishers, particularly those who are working in ASEAN, mainly the Indonesians and also the Philippines that tend to be the migrant itself outside ASEAN regionals. But my presentations today will do more on the issues of looking at migrations from the sea-based perspective. I think this will be the interest of most of the low degrees in here at the bachelor level of master level, and I will say that this area is rarely tapped in by many of the academia. If you go to the Google Scholars or anything searching about the maritime regimes and also the migrant workers of fishers, it will be very scarce or rarely found in terms of journal articles on the reports. And I will be very happy if at the end of the day that any of Atmajaya students would like to collaborate with me working on this, because in Paramadina University we don't have any law degree, only international relations. Sometimes it's hard for me to comprehend the logic of law, particularly the international law. If any of you would like interest to these issues. So I would start by mentioning that the migrant fishers right now are entrapped with the forced labor situations. World Free Foundation's ILO mentions that there are around 40 million today people living in the modern slavery modern slavery situations, and then ILO mentioned that this is an estimated number, 128,000 fishers, the migrant fishers right now, working in the forced labor situations. And this is really the pressing issues. I think you may have a lot of stories regarding how our Indonesian migrant fishers got quite a lot of trouble while working on the high seas, on Chinese fishing vessel, Korean fishing vessel, among others. So to address this issue, I think it is important for us first, can you, the full screen please, and then go to the third slide. Thank you very much. Sometimes it's easier to get a presentation done. So to address the labor issues, I think the first thing that we really need to do is first comprehend the complexities in regulating labor standards and also the migration pathways for the migrant fisher itself. So next please. And so if we're talking about the international law, as many of you may already heard of it, when we're talking about the forced labors and also talking about the promotions of labor standard and also competence, it's been already there since the UNCLOS adoptions. However, when we see about this, migrant fishers or the fishers have not enjoyed the same protections as the seafarers who are working on the commercial ships. Why is that? Can you next? Yes, next please. Yeah, why is that? Because in my assumptions, the seafarers who are working on the commercial ships are having a stronger regimes, international regimes that regulate their labor standard. Like for instance, we have maritime labor conventions, if any of you ever heard of it, in 2006, and was adopted by ILO in 2013. Historically, the maritime business, the commercial ships like logistic and any kind of commercial ships were a big business since the colonial era, because most of today's capitalistic systems were built through the sea route. And if you see this, the Maritime Labor Conventions is exactly trying to protect the labor standard for the seafarers. The labor standard then being protected include the hours of works, social security, employment contracts, recreational facilities, rooms, etc., among others. In the Maritime Labor Convention 2006, currently have been ratified by 100 countries, and most of the big maritime countries like China, UK, US, Germany have been ratified the convention as well. So according to many literature, initially the migrant fishers or the fishers, the seafarers, this is the two definition, the seafarers who were working at the fishing vessel supposed to be included in the maritime labor conventions. But unfortunately, they are excluded at the end of the adoptions. Why? It is because that the nature of fisheries itself as an industry has been characterized by its informal works, of which many of fisher itself doesn't employ in the formal relations of employment contract. And also in most country, fisheries right now is very well known for its small scale fisheries. And that's why at the discussion, the end of discussions of maritime labor conventions, they tend to exclude it and ask for another conventions that will be covered most of the labor standard for the fishers. And at the end, ILO introduced the new work in fishing conventions in 2007. The C-188, we call it in most of the literatures and the report. So actually, if we compare between the MLC and also the ILO C-188, they're currently mirroring what the provisions that had been written in the MLC 2006. But in comparison, only 20 countries as of today, 21 countries as of today ratify the C-188 as compared to the MLC over 100 countries. And none of the big fisheries countries like China, even Indonesia itself, one of the producers of the fishery, ratified the C-188 today. That's indicate the different way of protections because seafarers who are working on commercial ships right now enjoy most of the protections than the fishers itself. Next. Yeah. This is also one of the key issues as well if we would like to know about the international regime. But beforehand, another complexities that happen to the fishers tend to be weak, quite weak in unionizing and also forming an organizations. Because if we compare to the seafarers enjoy quite a lot of strong unions in home and also international level. Like for example, I've heard so many stories that seafarers being helped or assisted by, I don't know even any one of you know, International Transport Federations, the ITF globally, they work to protect most of the seafarers. But in terms of fishers, none of them actually, I've never had any stories or tell the success story regarding how the unions or the organizations, both in the local and globally, successfully promote the protections and the rights of the migrant fishers outside the issue of trafficking. Like for instance, in the issues of industrial relations, in negotiating the idea of employment mismatch or employment breaching contracts, for instance. And another issues that also complicate the matters is the three different regimes that currently under IMO, International Maritime Organizations, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organizations, and also ILO. And this is one of the very gap that we really need to tap in as an Indonesians if we would like to do seriously. I think it will be good for a bachelor thesis in law because I am very confident is nobody really writing this right now. Because the three different regimes at the international level currently trying to regulate the labor standard. At the FAO, initially they're only focused on the fish stocks, including the IUU fishing issues, but recently they are trying to tap into the labor standards. But the problem is, countries like China sometimes doesn't want to talk about labor. And at the IMO, it's also a problem because the certifications that they're used to do the skill and competence, and like most of the demand countries doesn't need any low skilled, any high skilled labor, only low skilled labor. And the ILO, it really depends on the national jurisdiction with this one C-188. So if China, Japan, South Korea do not ratify the C-188, so the C-188 will have no use for our migrant fishers coming for instance, Indonesia and Philippines. Okay, next. So I only have 2 minutes left. And next. And next again. Again next. So I will skip. Now, so This is going to be my last slide. This is the migration path that I collected from over 50 interview with Indonesian migrant fishers going abroad. So in particular, there is no difference between the migration pathway between the land-based and the sea-based until they reach the destination countries. Because in destination countries, then the fishers will be in two positions. They will be working on the exclusive economic zone, which is under state territory, or they will be working on the high seas. And the high seas is considered as the commons because no sovereignty can tap into the high seas. In the logic of lack of convenience, so the ships is actually the floating sovereignty, the floating state in the high seas. So this is going to be complicated for the migrants. Why itself? Because when they're going to work on the high seas, like for instance, I am a Singaporean boat owners, but I'm using the Chinese flag. And when Indonesian workers are working at the fishing vessel with the Singaporean Singaporean nationality owners and also flag state of China, which jurisdictions actually applies to this person when we're talking about protections. And this has happened because sometimes Chinese flag vessel dock at the Singaporean port and disembark the workers and violations discovered. And sometimes the authority is confused which law actually apply for the labor inspection. So that's why sometimes labor inspections in the fishing vessels is overlooked in this instance. So what happened in the Southeast Asian countries? South Asian countries tend to take a pragmatic approach by ensuring more law is enforced in the sourcing countries. And right now, if I select Indonesian example, for instance, they tend to bring the discourse to the procedural and unprocedural way of migrations, ensuring that all migrants have the proper procedures and know exactly their risk and their right before departing. But for me, it will be risky because the procedural and the unprocedural way is very close to the land-based logic, where the actors seems like in the case of sea-based, we assume that the actors have a full power to monitor and supervise those who are working in the high seas. And in the high seas, only those who are working at the vessel and God who know what happened at the high seas. I think I will stop right there, Mas Awi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Give applause to Pak Benny to already untangle the so much complexity working in the middle of high sea, especially those who are working in the middle of high sea, because there are unrecognized or difficult to justify which the jurisdiction applied. So that's why it has a lot of consequences in terms of inspection, labor protection here and there, and always we heard horrible things about those who are working on the sea-based worker, especially Pak Benny also mentioned the difference between sea-based worker and also seafarer and also fishers. So then somehow fishers not really that put a lot of in a favor because weak of international arrangement as well as also still limited labor union on in terms of fisher. So that's why forced labor, human trafficking are there. So I think it's also good to incorporate these particular issues in the process of ASEAN, that now next week we will wait whether ASEAN finally will adopt or will have or no an initiative to have ASEAN declaration on the protection of migrant fisher. So I was invited like a month ago in Bali to have this negotiation. See how if this region wanna have a document, like a political commitment to protect migrant fisher. So later on, maybe we can move a bit forward in terms of providing and protecting the rights of sea-based workers, especially migrant fishers. Thank you so much once again, Pak Benny. Now we move to the third speaker here, Abigail Guevara from Migrant Forum Asia. Please, you could share about what MFA has been doing and what's been advocating so far, and what's your main agenda, especially in this context of ASEAN. Please have a very warm welcome to Abigail.
Thank you, Daniel, for that introductions. And I share the same sentiment with the two other previous speakers that while migrant workers and especially fishermen are serve as frontliners, they are always underpaid, underprotected, and undervalued in their own sector. So I have prepared a short presentation for visibility as well. And so I'll start with my intervention. Yesterday, we have heard the impact of climate change on not only on migrant workers, but to all people in ASEAN countries. So nowadays, we have witnessed a multitude of urgent demands, starting from health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate change, as well as conflict crisis that have made us more aware of the absence of the social and economic justice in our region. Next slide please. Every human being, regardless of their gender, religion, race, disability, color, or immigration status, in particular for the migrant workers, should have equal access to wealth and opportunity, food sovereignty, education, housing, and all others, so that even in times of catastrophe, they will still be able to live life with dignity. It has been proven during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that it exacerbated inequalities, it revealed deep societal issues within our own countries, and it propelled anxieties. And as evident as it is, it affected really heavily our economic and social progress in our region, which is ASEAN. When we try to visit the ASEAN engagements and ASEAN processes over the years, we already have the social protection floors. So the social protection floors define the set of social security guarantees that aim to prevent or alleviate poverty. But in reality, it is partially fulfilled for large majority, as social protection benefits most of the time, they have limiting conditions as well as discriminatory provisions. For how many more decades are we going to ask that big question, that when we look into the realities of the lives of the ASEAN people behind ASEAN's promise to take a sustainable and people-centered and people-oriented approach in all their commitment towards the people. Next slide please. I will be stating two pressing issues. First is the decent work, social protection, and life with dignity. And second is education for all. So first is social protection. When you talk about social protection in a working population, it is mainly for the formal workers, those workers who are working in formal sectors. Employers' liability, their shortcomings still remain unsolved, and predominant practice in providing maternity benefits, in providing loss of employment, as well as sickness benefits to the employees. While the services provided by the government remains not affordable for the marginalized people, it is not sufficient and lack of coverage because just to prove, because there are some social protection, for example, disability benefits. If you are partially disabled, they will cover that. But if you are fully disabled, they will cover that. But if you are partially disabled, they will not cover that. So they have that discriminating provisions as well. But in case of the migrant workers, only 22% in destination countries are covered by social protection. And moreover, while 70 out of 163 countries have social protection laws, less than half of that 70 include domestic workers in the countries of destination. But even prior the pandemic, migrant workers are really explicitly excluded in social protection benefits because first is they are non-nationals. And second issue, for women, in many countries of destination, domestic work and caregiving work are beyond the purview of the national labor regulations. So that means domestic workers and caregivers usually have the least capacity for them to access social protection as well as for them to achieve financial stability in the long run. Next slide, please. So what are the social security concerns of the low-wage earners? First is coverage. Like what I have mentioned a while ago, they are excluded because they are non-nationals. Second is portability. For example, or for instance that they are provided with social security benefits, often they lost that when they decide to go back to their home countries due to restrictions of export of benefits abroad to non-nationals. And the third concern is minimum qualifying conditions. So what do we mean by this? Qualifying conditions because most of the domestic workers only have 2 years contract in the country of destination. If possible, they renew, but most of them, after 2 years, they go back to their home countries. So given that short time span in the country of origin, the employment period is too short to meet the eligibility criteria required for that social protection benefits. Example, old-term protection. Next slide, please. Second pressing issue is the learning losses caused by the closure of schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. Another possibility under the Asean Social Protection Guarantee is to provide universal primary education. The likelihood that the child will accomplish the primary school and acquire the essential literacy that he or she must have is greatly depends on the socio-economic variables, the quality of the schools, and what other obstacles he or she may face. But in reality, those children in rural areas are disproportionately affected because they are less likely to get the information and other important details as well. So even worse, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when schools decided to close and shift to online, many children were left behind, such as those who are children of migrant workers, children with disabilities, low-income household, because they do not have that connectivity, the devices, as well as the availability of electricity for those who are living in rural areas, which many countries in ASEAN failed to address this issue, even if they have that 3 years or 2 to 3 years span. So what can be done? First is that social protection is actually a prominent key component of the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2025, which the measures and its floors are indicators in order for us to achieve the SDG Goal 1, which is to alleviate poverty. We can only achieve this if we will provide an adequate level of social protection to all members of society, meaning there's no discriminatory or no conditions for you to get social protection. Second is that there is a need to continuously address gender-driven wages because in many cases, both men and women are working in the same sector, but men are earning much bigger compared to men. So it happens. And for us to promote equal opportunity to a more balanced growth in all members of our society. Next slide, please. So let me end my presentation to, after all, living with dignity shouldn't be too much to ask for. So let us push for social protection for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail Guevara, who really also echoing and supporting the advocacy on the social protection, because from your advocacy in MFA doing show up, especially after COVID, you mentioned previously. So COVID proved that the vulnerability of migrant worker becoming much more easier to be seen, as they are somehow cannot access some social protection in the host countries of migration, because they are not nationals, yeah, or not citizens of those host countries. So the decent work, social protection needs to be advocated further, and by doing it, social protection, we also somehow contributing to the SDGs, especially SDGs number 1, yeah, to eliminating poverties. So if we can refer one of the works done by ASEAN last year, when Cambodia hold the chairship of ASEAN, the declarations of ASEAN portability, social protection is already there. So I think now it's time to question or push further what kinds of portability social protection it is, how it can be accessed by migrant communities, those who are working in the, you mentioned about as a domestic worker, caregiver, but also I'd like to add a bit what Pak Benny has mentioned earlier about the sea-based and migrant visa. So thank you so much, Abigail, for addressing the decent work as well as social protection, because it's like about the dignity of every human being. So I'd like to move further to the discussion, especially on this particular social protection. We have someone joining from, expert joining from the Vietnam. Are you already there?
Yes, I'm here. Please, yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Please,
I'm sure that, you know, we did also some
please allow me to share the screen.
So wait a minute again, yeah. Tuha, the Asian Roundtable on Social Protection. Tuha, is it you? From Vietnam? No. Tuha?
Okay. Yeah, I'm here. Ready. Yeah, I'm here. Ready. Yeah, I'm
Okay. Let's welcome Tuha and give applause to Tuha to share her thought as on the social protection. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you, the organizer, to allow me to talk. My topic is the life dignity and beyond. Because the say that it can talk broader than concern. So for the breast issue, education is natural and man-made. Like a post-COVID-19, you already. So here it means that also unemployment, healthcare, and also it's kind of and considerations citizenship to climate change induced catastrophe become more and more serious. was not only within but also global.
the situation of ASEAN, but also global. So Russia and China,
Sorry, and some others like
economic liberalization.
we talk a lot, and it's
We
not
talk a
new,
lot,
but
and it's not new. It become
more and more basic.
more basic.
Design here. See, food
Security
security and food sovereignty.
See, food security and food sovereignty is sealed.
For healthcare
And high cost for healthcare, like a medicine,
achievement of the common good.
production of the common good.
This, as Abby said before,
This, as we said before, on for example, on the school education for children, for example, or the public hospital.
Poor social protection
And other thing is the poor social protection and public.
so clearly after the COVID, and it seems that now our government is not decisive in upgrades the public healthcare system. And other countries start to emerge from the crisis and press the increase to put in place austerity measures like for World Bank or IMF. This is because that pressing issue, because it's some kind of pressure from the one who control money, right? And so I just take some example of some like a deep dive example on what
deep
does
dive
it mean
example
economic
on what does it mean economic liberalization design.
A lot of people talk a lot
For example, here we talk
global
a
crisis.
lot of people talk a lot
And
about
in,
global crisis.
It's not only
And in
global,
it's not only global, it's not only in ASEAN, it's global. But when we talk about economic liberalization, modernization of agriculture and fisheries, corporate expansion, international food system, and privatization in most sectors have been rampant across the region. And what is the reason? Reason is a deterioration of public goods, service, and consumption, erosion of local food self-sufficiency, community,
women control over food and nutrition.
Women control over food and nutrition. Transfer of land to LTLs and corporate, and conversion of land and forest for industry and
this one type
structure proposed. This one type example. It's not new. It's a for over past decade, but it become more and more serious.
What else? Something is
what else? Something is the reason in inequality. Because when we talk about social economy, just
and here
we talk about equality, right? And here you can say that. You can say that.
It is a current model.
It is a current model of the agriculture. Of the food value chain, that we can see that the share of value reaching by farmer has been steadily decreasing. You can see the rice farmer, they can earn as little as 4% only of the price paid by the consumer, according to one
talking about social addiction.
Talking about social addiction, Abby in the previous presentation, you talked a lot about it. And here just some figure for you to see.
We agree that the ASEAN has one very good initiative
that come up with the common framework
for social protection
and plan for social protection.
We need to see also what is the
but we need to see also what is our situation now. It's really low risk coverage in ASEAN. You see, in ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia. So we say it's only 33%. 33%. That compared to the GDP.
And about the expenditure. 33% of the coverage. Expenditure is too low.
Expenditure is too low to be.
You see the audit.
Too low. You see the audit. This is the ASEAN country.
4.5%.
It's average 4.5%, 4.9%.
So we need to push.
We need to push for more and more. But
what the challenge that we highlighted in the last APF still remain: privatization and austerity, pressure to scaling down public services and social protection programs, and domination of neoliberalism. These things we still need still remain the challenge. And also other challenge that I would like to add up. That's where the voice of worker and community in the decision-making process and monitoring of low carbon economy for a just transition. Because people talk a lot about green economy, green job, carbon credit and emission, and blah, blah, etc. So where the voice of the people to have a fair decision so they can have a fair benefit. And way forward, I propose that we continue and deepen analysis on our demands of the last APA for life with dignity, social protection, decent work, and healthcare for all in the post-COVID. For example, when we talk about universal social protection, healthcare for all, we talk about improved accessibility, affordability, and quality of social protection and public social services. And we talk about the need for specific voluntary social protection programs for informal workers. We talk about maternity protection for all women in need. And we talk about social protection and healthcare for migrant workers. And also talk about building shock response capacity. So we need to deepen our analysis on these things and bring good practice to highlight and more specify our demand towards enabling empower social and solidarity economy and inclusive and participatory agriculture digitalization. This issue that raised in one of the conversion space of last period or of last IPA. But we need to deepen them and bring the good practice to highlight these things, not say in general anymore. And we need to discuss and build up our position toward just transition, especially from the perspective of labor rights and community rights, where voice and skill development for alternative livelihoods, among others, are essential. And also we need to demand for stronger demand space for social partners to be actively engaged and consented to ensure that they can effectively shape any potential reform measures to safeguard social and economic outcomes. And how regional solidarity can contribute. In last APF, we have a good initiative that's APF and AROS together with PRONET, Southeast Asia, MFA, WIGO, Acsc, and Inspire Asean. We're working together to promote decent work, universal healthcare and social protection for all in ASEAN. And we would like to continue this kind of solidarity in the coming APA with an ambition that we could involve more representatives from the youth, LGBT, and the people with difficulties to the cooperation team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Van Chuha. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation about the importance of life in dignity and promoting social protection for all. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Raquel, who may share more broadened context, especially on the economic injustice. So we've been doing like maybe bottom up, yeah, from what's happening on the ground. Now maybe Raquel, you can give us some insight about maybe the economic arrangement happening in this region. Let's invite Raquel to give 10 minutes for your input. Please have a warm welcome to Raquel.
Thank you. Is my audio okay? Is my audio okay? It is having an echo in the Zoom room. So, okay. So, solidarity greetings to you all. The title of my trigger talk is about breaking the shackles to socioeconomic justice. And with these are inequality, corporate abuse, regressive taxes, and debt distress. The irony of the world perceiving Asia and ASEAN within it as driving the world economic growth is that it is happening at the same time as inequality is rising in the region. In Asia, newly industrialized and even low income countries have all been registering higher increases in their Gini ratios, which is an indicator of income inequality. The World Bank has calculated those with the highest inequalities as the Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore, followed by Indonesia, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Forbes magazine counts 128 billionaires in Southeast Asia, not including their royalty and politicians. The richest identified being, for example, Robert Budi Hartono of Indonesia, Dahnin Cheeravanont of Thailand, Lit Siting of Singapore, Manuel Villar of Philippines, Pham Nahat Vuong of Vietnam. Obscenely, the wealthy were reportedly able to increase their combined wealth by about 30% during the pandemic, while people died for lack of access to healthcare or other protections or other social protections. That is why in the Philippines and in other countries, the idea of a wealth tax is gaining ground. In a paper commissioned by the APMDD, Professor Ed Tadem notes, as a corresponds to inequality, proposals for a wealth tax on a country's richest citizens have been proposed. A wealth tax is a levy imposed on an individual's net worth, all the forms of that person's wealth can take, for example, real estate, shares in stocks, etc. More than anything else, it is a social justice measure. But this is not all. There is need to make an outcry by people and civil society against illicit financial flows and corporate tax abuse. The State of Tax Justice 2020 reports that the 10 ASEAN countries plus Timor-Leste have together lost an estimated 15 billion US dollars in taxes to international tax abuse in just 1 year. Whether lost to multinational corporations shifting profit into tax havens in order to underreport how much profit they actually made in the countries where they do business, and consequently paying less taxes than they should, or lost to wealthy individuals hiding undeclared assets and incomes offshore beyond the reach of the law. The top three countries in ASEAN doing this are Indonesia, Singapore, and Philippines, with Malaysia on the fourth spot, according to the report. Multinational corporations exploit the different national tax systems of countries, and ASEAN countries should see the value of a UN tax convention and an intergovernmental tax mechanism, just like what African countries are proposing. A self-appointed rulemaking by the world's largest economies through the OECD, the G20, which had just had the summit in Indonesia last year. Their framework of base erosion and profit shifting, or BEPS framework, is attempting to deprive developing countries of their ability to mobilize resources, domestic resources for their recovery, their public services, and their social protection needs by pushing for a global minimum corporate tax rate of only 15%, a huge drop from the 25% average corporate rate of developing countries. Meanwhile, multilateral banking institutions like the ADB is prescribing increase in regressive consumption taxes, just like VAT, value-added tax, and GST, goods and services tax, because they say anyway, the poor buy mostly from the informal economy, which supposedly does not pay taxes. They are also advancing fiscal consolidation, a technical jargon, which for people translates to government austerity measures and withdrawal of tax exemptions. Perhaps even for senior citizens, I have heard some talks about this because some policymakers say that anyway, not all of them are poor and they should be taxed. Already, Indonesia and Singapore have raised their VAT. Thailand also did this, but a royal decree reduced it back, but only until September this year. So after September, maybe you can expect higher VAT again. Fellow advocates from India have this to say about the gendered impact of VAT, and we should do well in the ACSCAPF to raise our voices on the issue. Inequities in how and from whom taxes are raised can be antithetical to the realization of human rights for women and girls and reducing gender inequality. Different methods of raising taxes have diverse distributional effects. Indirect taxes, such as the value-added tax, levied on the consumption of goods and services, are regressive in nature, as they are applicable to both rich and poor consumers. The overall direct tax rates in Asia at a regional scale are among some of the lowest, but among the high levels of dependence on indirect taxes. This hurts the poor as the proportion of one's income going towards indirect taxes tends to be higher at lower levels of income, as well as impacts women as they tend to spend more on household items, which attract consumption taxes. In the constricted fiscal space that ASEAN countries find themselves in the aftermath of the pandemic, it is not socioeconomic justice to tax the bottom half, the same as the upper 10%, just to shore up national budgets. Because the top 10% already enjoy 49.9% share of the national incomes in Southeast Asia, while the entire bottom half share a measly 11.6%. But neither is it socioeconomic justice to irresponsibly get mired in unsustainable national government debt, since it will be people, especially the next young generation, who will be burdened with debt repayments in the coming years, whether through taxes or cuts in public expenditures for health, education, job creation, and other needs. In fact, this is the exact right time for citizens' debt audits to examine which are questionable, including those that funded projects that may have violated human rights or destroyed environments. Among ASEAN, Lao PDR is said to be in debt distress, with public and publicly guaranteed debt going from about 70% of GDP in 2019 to 88% in 2021, according to their government figures and also to the IMF. In the Philippines, the debt to GDP ratio of 39% in 2019 reached 65% in 2022, according to the Freedom from Debt Coalition. Communities and CSOs, well, apart from debt, the debt distress, communities and CSOs are up in arms against the steep increases in prices of basic commodities and public services as inflation hit people already reeling with loss of jobs and livelihoods. The corporate sector, on the other hand, have dismissed it as being merely moderate and benign. The marked increase in high prices was linked to the disruptions in supply chains during the COVID years, but also blamed in large part, whether valid or not, to the Russia-Ukraine war. To arrest inflation and in knee-jerk response to US monetary policies, most central banks in Asian countries are moving to raise policy interest rates, notably Malaysia and Philippines. But this could trigger either a slowdown or a recession in their countries. CSOs have been repeatedly saying that the way to address the problem was to support local farmers and producers of food and basic commodities, especially the smallholders, as well as support the local territorial markets set up by the communities. But as usual, the blind neoliberal policy response is to import, import, and import all the stuff that has become scarce to bring down the prices, including inputs for agricultural production. And of course, since this was exploited by big importers, agricultural sector has been decimated in many of our countries and food sovereignty largely imperiled. To compound our misery, the RCEP or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership has been signed and ratified in some parliaments of our countries. The other neoliberal recipe gaining traction again with governments is privatization of public services. With electricity and water getting more expensive and supply inadequate, national officials are reverting to the debunked, or at least to the unfounded narrative that the private sector will deliver cheaper, more efficient public services. In these times of huge learning losses, as Abigail mentioned earlier in the education sector, and the urgent need for universal healthcare after the pandemic, as Tuhak mentioned earlier, the modes of provision being put forward indicate more and more reliance on the business sector rather than through public provision. I also wanted to talk a bit about financialization as CSOs need to understand it, its insidious impact on people and sectors. Financialization is a process whereby financial markets, financial institutions, and financial elite gain greater influence over economic policy and economic outcomes, elevating the significance of the financial sector. But I am not yet very confident discussing its ramifications, I leave this to our other experts in civil society and social movements to tackle, alongside with issues of digitalization. Thank you everyone for your attention. I hope I have triggered a lot of
Thank you
reflections
so much. Thank
with
you so
my
much.
talk.
Amazing, Raquel. Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. We get a lot of, enlightful presentation from you, trying to untangle what's really happening, not just only in the Philippines, but also in the entire region. You touch upon this, the privatization, the tax abuses, inequality, tax justice, a very, very interesting term to be elaborated more later on, but I'm sure that this is not the end. We will still have a September event for to be have some detailed side event or sub workshop. I have one concern, one question from the Zoom, but from here I'd like to also collect if you have any concern and question. I have one here. Okay, two. Okay, so I'd like to first read from the Zoom. First is what to extend to which social security, health, BPJS, and labor protection migrant worker and workers who experience violence. This is the first speaker, question, maybe addressed to Pak Bobby, yeah? And then the second, how is the protection and recognition of the rights of migrant workers, fishermen, including in the event of sexual violence at work, both in convention and local policies and implementation in the field. So there are two concerns, yeah, about the social protection, who experience violence about it, and the second about the violence on sexual violence at works, whether the convention and local policies have also touched around it. I'd like to invite a lady over there, yeah, Ibu Nasrika, if I'm not mistaken, and then also in front. Could you pass the mic, the organizer? Thank you. Yeah, or just move forward, Nasrika.
Yeah, the first I would like to thanks to the organizer and also the speaker. They talk about the social and economic justice. Yeah, while many countries now there is talk about justice and also anti-trafficking and also anti-forced labor, but they are forget about us. I'm talk on behalf of the migrant and domestic worker. They are forget about us. Even though our contribution is cannot deny, our contribution is so big and so huge to the countries, even though the host country and even the destination countries. But the government only see that they only give this. The day when I come to the airport, I was, wow, in the carpet they seen VVIP, pekerja migran Indonesia. So they said VVIP, but on the ground there is, we don't need that kind of what is that? Yeah, treatment. Yeah, we just need the protection. As for your people know that until now in Indonesia and also in Malaysia, we don't have any protection. So we are excluded from many protection, even in the laws itself. In Indonesia, almost 20 years, we are fighting to get protected by the laws. But until now, the government and the parliament still not pass it. I don't know why. And also, even in Malaysia, they have amend their laws. They still only changed the term. Previously, it's domestic servant, and now they only change domestic employee. Domestic employee, yes. But there's the protection still discriminate us. For example, the working hours, overtime, and also for the maternity leave, they are exclude us. So many of our friends in Malaysia, they work in domestic worker, they work almost 24 hours on call. 1 a.m. mostly people sleep, but if they will knock to the, can you please cook for us? They will be definitely cook for you. But the treatment, even the salary, still a lot of them underpaid because in their wages regulation, they still mention exclude for the informal sector. So even in Malaysia, there's a salary is 1,500. Some they still receive 900, 1,000. And it happened in Indonesia as well. So it's, we are cannot feel VR is not really seen by the government. I hope by this forum and through all people can speak more and in place invite and involve us, include us in the protection. And also when Pak Bobby said, that's the number of the BPJS claim, why so small? So it means the government only encourage us to pay, not to get any benefit. Because it's very difficult to claim. It's not really, we don't want to claim. Because it's very difficult and also the access to claim. Even though they already always push us to pay.
Thank you.
But there's very small, what is that there?
Small chance to get.
No, the information.
Oh,
The information is so not really shared to the public. They only say have to pay like this, have to pay like this, but they never say how to claim it. Yeah, I think that is my share. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasrika from Pertimik Malaysia ya, Indonesian migrant community in Malaysia. Thanks for sharing your concern ya, especially on the protection side and dealing with the limited information about the social protection insurance as well as the little numbers of successful claim. So I'd like to invite you here.
Thank you so much. So, let me introduce myself first. My name is Misha, and Acsc from Plan International. My focus area is the policy level, like SAC and ASEAN. A brief history of me, like I like the second presentation. It's very hit to the point because I work with United Nations on drug and crime, especially on the global maritime crime program before. So I know well on Sulawesi, especially on in Philippines and Indonesia. And also I work with IO ship to shore project on the fishery project, but I'm focused on regional. So I may not know much like you guys because I'm not specific on the country. And I work with FAO in the animal disease when you talk about livestock. So I want to say on my opinion only, I feel like when we work in regional level, I speak like when I work with the UN, it's very difficult when we dealing with the government in each country, especially in here. And they very well corrupted. I like the Coast Guard in Indonesia, and I work with the heads of Coast Guard here, the Navy, Custom, everyone. Because when we talk about the migrant, it's not only IO job, it's not FAO job. It is the law enforcement agency like UNODC. They are an expert. They can because like when we talk about like social protection or like welfare, for me I believe in law enforcement because the law is force people to do like many cases I file but are on the reports because I don't go to the field, but I feel like even you train the migrant worker in seafood sector, like in Thailand, we also have the seafood sector. They know their right. They know, but because the minimum low wage and the private sector is not collaborate with us, they don't care. They just like, I will pay this amount. Will you okay? If you're not okay, then you go. It's just like that. So it's not only government, it's also the private sector. But for me, I feel like what forced the private sector is law enforcement. Like because like I what to say, like I cannot say much, but I know like the police and everything, if they in the policy level enforce it to local level and force to like private sector. For example, like in South Korea, they're very serious about like migrant blah blah blah. I think ASEAN can do the same and we can raise the issue. But that, again, it's not only NGO, it's also like United Nations. It's not IO, IOM, FAO, it's also UNODC. They know very well, and I believe that maybe in the next round if we can invite some of them, like I know Indonesian colleague who work with my team before. They work very hard, part of the ASEAN in the consultation. And when you talk about the sea, I would say that most of the labor in the Indonesia or the private company is in the Taiwan and Chinese, and it's political issue between the sea. It's very difficult for ASEAN to say yes or no. Like it's the border of the international maritime. Yeah, that's only my personal opinion. But I feel like if we strengthen our like meeting conference NGO, and I think it could be push ASEAN into the like accommodation and policy. Thank you.
So I'd like to invite every one of you, maybe 5 minutes each. So meaning that it will be, we have 5 speakers. Maybe allow me to have a so allow us to will be end a bit yeah, maybe 10 minutes after all. So I'd like to invite Pak Bobby first to respond about the BPJS and claim and everything, and then about sexual violence at work, and also concerning this question, and follow you, and then Raquel also Tuan in Vietnam.
Kami sudah sering ini ya audiensi atau diskusi dengan BPJS ataupun Kementerian Ketenagakerjaan, termasuk dengan Dewan Jaminan Sosial Nasional DJSN. Jadi intinya Kalau kami berdiskusi dengan BPJS Pekerja Migran Indonesia, jawabannya pasti dia hanya sebagai pelaksana. Jadi aturannya itu yang menerbitkan adalah Kementerian Ketenagakerjaan. Jadi dia given aja gitu ya. Dia nggak bisa merubah apapun yang ada di dalam aturan itu. Jadi memang kembali lagi yang harus dikritisi memang di dalam hal pembuatan peraturan menterinya ya, tentang yang mengatur tentang BPJS PMI. Sayangnya ini di dalam pembuatan atau pembentukan peraturan perundang-undangan di bawah undang-undang, misalnya peraturan pemerintah, peraturan menteri, itu lebih tertutup daripada membuat undang-undangnya sendiri. Jadi nggak pernah melibatkan misalnya masyarakat sipil, organisasi serikat buruh migran misalnya, itu nggak pernah libatin. Nah sehingga program yang ada di BPJS ataupun asuransi TKI itu tidak menarik sama sekali ya. Di dalam hal contohnya misalnya ya, kita bandingkan antara santunan asuransi di Indonesia atau dengan di Taiwan, dengan di Korea, itu jauh banget itu. Misalnya yang meninggal dunia ya, kalau BPJS itu hanya santunannya senilai 80 juta. Di Taiwan itu 1000 NT atau sekitar sekarang sudah naik ya, 1.500.000 NT, sorry. Itu sekitar 800 juta. Di Korea itu lebih besar lagi, hampir 1 miliar. Di kita 80 juta, bandingkan tuh. Jadi nggak menarik banget gitu di dalam hal ininya ya. Nah, tapi itu wajib, itu problemnya itu wajib kayak gitu. Jadi memang saya melihat ada polanya juga ya. Dulu di tahun 2017 Menteri Tenaga Kerja itu menerbitkan peraturan BPJS PMI nomor berapa itu ya. Itu 1 tahun sebelum pemilihan. Sekarang 1 tahun sebelum pemilihan, sebelum pemilu, diterbitkan lagi yang baru dengan memasukkan jaminan kecelakaan kerja. Salah satunya yang dijamin adalah korban tindak kekerasan seksual dan kekerasan fisik, memasukkan 2 itu. Jadi kayaknya di setiap pemilihan itu jelang pemilihan ada yang baru kayak gitu, tambahan yang baru. Jadi problemnya sebenarnya mudah itu ya, apakah kita bisa lihat kebijakannya. Kalau saya jadi anggota DPR nanti Pak, itu saya intervensi betul itu. Demikian ya Mas Awi.
Terima kasih, thank you so much Pak Bubi. I'd like to pass to Pak Beni.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think this is sexual exploitations on the fishers, right? We're talking about it. So the first, I think I will mention regarding the social security. Regarding the social security, we have the C-188 regulate the social security, and most of the local governments regulations like in Taiwan and also in Indonesia also regulate the social security for the fishers. So mainly the social security for the fishers consists of 3 main provisions. The first is access to the security for regarding to the accidents and also regarding to the deaths during the time of works, and the second is regarding to the health social security, and the third is access to grievance in the time of exploitations or things. So but the issue is with the social security is actually again which country is supposed to give the social security to the fisher itself. In the context of migrations in Indonesia, if you go to with the procedural way, then it means that you need to be registered with BPJS like the migrant workers on the land base, of which it only covers around 80 million at maximum if accident happen. 80 million rupiah maximum if had accident happen outside. But in Taiwan, for instance, if you are registered through Taiwanese insurance, you can get more than 300 million rupiah if accident happen or death at sea happen to you. So the complexity in social security then relies on which actually like also the claim mechanism similar to the land base is quite difficult as well. And sometimes there is I think there is a corruptions in the mining agencies that we found. Also, I think it was captured on Greenpeace SBMI's recent movies when that also is a business for most of mining agents because they can claim two different insurance of the fishers if in the events of a death itself. So actually talking about social security is also complex, but don't forget to mention also social security is we need to ensure that decent work at the fishing vessel can be upheld during their time of works. But again, in the high seas, if you are working on the high seas, who can actually monitor the high seas? So this always be my concern. Even though like now in Taiwan, in South Korea, they're trying to put Wi-Fi on board on the vessels. But again, how about the access? They have the satellite phones. The satellite phone is quite expensive for the migrant worker to access. How the mechanism can be upheld for the monitoring? So not only the social security, but we need to talk about how we as people in ASEAN, also maybe like NGOs and things, can monitor even maybe I call it surveillance the working conditions at sea, particularly for the workings for the fishers. And right now the most pragmatic approach is forcing Indonesian unions or Philippines unions or any kind of union who are working with fishers to have the collective bargaining agreement with the sourcing countries, so we can have more protections and also put all the social security during the collective bargaining agreement with the ship owner or the representative of the ship owners. So regarding the sexual exploitations, Mas Awi, to be honest, my data during my research over like 5 years following these issues misrepresented for the sexual exploitations. There is a sexual exploitations, but a very minimum in terms of fishers. My assumption in this sense is like the fisheries industry, particularly the high seas industry, is a very structures with the hegemonic masculinity structures. With the hegemonic masculine structures, they tend to avoid talking about the sexual misconduct or things during the time of works. They tend to tell the stories about what you call it, maybe the strong effort in maintaining the works, the very hard works and the exploitations, and the way that they never try to explain their experience as a failure. So the stigma of the hegemonic masculinity is quite high in the high seas, then it will I think it will burden down more on the sexual exploitation. I cannot answer the sexual exploitation today, but then if there isn't a sexual exploitation, I think most of the current regulations today can afford to address the issues. And yes, I agree with you also with the regarding the complexity with the piracy and things in the region. And I think the sector of fisheries is similar with Mbak Nasrika mentions with domestic workers, because the fisheries industry, yeah, in the domestic workers, 12 o'clock midnight, you can the majikan or the boss can tell the migrant workers to work. In fisheries industry, in the high seas, even 24 hours, you cannot say that they can have a rest or a good resting hours like the domestic workers. And sometimes the level of hypocrisy of the government is also the same, Mbak Nasrika. Like for instance, we want to protect domestic workers abroad, but then we neglect the domestic workers inside Indonesia, for instance. And it's the same with the fishery industry. We dramatize the way our Indonesian migrant fisher exploit by foreign workers or foreign fishing vessel. But don't you see that in front of your eyes? Maybe here in North Jakarta, you can go to the North Jakarta and see that the internal migrations between Jakarta and then they are going to the high seas in Papua. It's really the same structure of exploitations, but we neglect on it and then trying to not talking about it. So if we really want to think about how to protect and uphold the social security, we really need to balance between the local and also the national if we would like to create more better approach in thinking on how we can protect the migrant workers. So maybe the issue will be not only the divisions between the local and migrant, but this is the issues of how we can be conscious that we are right now is a working class, not a bourgeois. That's I think my point of view, Mas Awi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benny. I'd like to pass on, yeah, to you, Raquel, to address some concern that may be related from your points of your presentation. Thank you so much.
Just to add on what the previous speakers have already mentioned, we are now confronted with fast changing migration trends such as visit visas in the Middle East and seasonal workers, mostly for the ASEAN countries, where in fact, when that happens, most migrant workers have less access to social protection and others. But this time, it was proven that some local governments are involved in this process, which makes it more difficult, or which makes the battlefield gets more broader and more harder to resolve. With Nasrika's point, actually, when we talk about social protection, we're not only eyeing for health care or for health insurance. We must ensure that migrant workers and those working in informal sectors are getting sufficient coverage. That means end of term benefits as well as old age pensions for the sustainability of social protection. In some instances, when migrant workers are covered with social protection benefits, there are some obstacles arising. For example, first is language barriers. Second is transportation costs. Given that the migrant worker have this health card, for example, and then he or she needs to travel 2 hours from his office or work. First is that transportation costs can be a burden to migrant worker who is not receiving wages monthly. So that thing should be resolved. So I appreciate that we have this APF in May, because for the migrant advocates who will be present for the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labor, we can carry whatever recommendations or whatever important or salient points that will transpire from this to lobby with the governments who are present in the AFML.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abigail. And I'd like to invite Fan Chu Han. Is still also touch around the concern on social protection, on how are we going to advocate further. I offer to you. Or if having difficulties, I'd like to invite Raquel. Okay, so go ahead.
Um, Uha? Okay. Uha? Okay. Please. Please. Is Tua speaking?
Is that okay?
I just want to give
Okay, go ahead.
one
Yes.
very
Yes. Go.
brief reflection, and that is, we've been talking a lot in this panel on socio-economic justice, on migrant work. But we also need to look at the bigger picture, that migrant work within our countries, being pushed by our governments as um, as a way so that the economy can stay afloat, is really not well, for me, I don't think it's that sustainable, because for one thing, we do not even count the social costs that's happening. Of course, we are addressing their issues because they're already out there, they're already being exploited, they're already being abused. But we also need to address the job creation needed at home, in our domestic sphere, in our countries, so that they don't need to go out. Our countries, same. Indonesia and Philippines, we have migrant work, and also we have business process outsourcing. And these two sectors, always our government rely on them for the dollars to come in. but then what is the cost? And we see that, I cannot imagine mothers wanting to go out to take care of other families' children and not being able to take care of their own children at home. So, yeah, just this reflection I wanted to share with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
hello.
You touch a very important point. Tuhan, yeah, are you there?
Hello, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to share one. Okay, when you ask about how to advocate further, right, on social protection in
Yes, yes.
ASEAN, I think that we need to emphasize two things, or three things. One is evidence based. We need to have evidence base to collect evidence base, and second, we need to have a dialogue space with ASEAN body. We need to advocate for that as well. It's not only for social protection, but also for APA. Because currently, we all see that our space in dialogue with ASEAN is very limited. We need to broaden that. We need to interact more with ASEAN. We need to talk more with them. We need to have a policy dialogue. And the third one, and that one is not only at ASEAN level, but also at country level. And the third one is at country level. When we talk about ASEAN, we cannot, we need to take into account that country advocacy is very important, because it be some kind of example or provide good practice to share in ASEAN. So it can be, advised or inspired by other ASEAN countries if some countries have a good practice. So that's my point.
All right, thank you so much for certain suggestions. So by that, I think we've been already having a very insightful and thorough discussion, and somehow some proposals of ways forward as our joint advocacy. But I'd like to a bit go back to what Raquel has mentioned about the importance to remember or to remind that there are some groups of stay behind or left behind children that somehow it becoming a paradox of care. Some of them are taking care others, but maybe their own kids or their own parent also left behind. I think it's also important point to be highlighted. And then mentioning also about job creation, and lastly, how to advocate further in this region, especially on the agenda in ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labor, AFML, as well as much more, like more dialogue, more advocacy in ASEAN. So by that, I'd like to thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Daniel Awigra from Human Rights Working Group, the Secretariat of BBC, Better Engagement Between East and Southeast Asia. I'd like to conclude and then looking forward to having another session. I pass on to the mic. Thank you so much, all speakers, and also who are joining online. Nothing but thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we just finished our thematic discussion too, and it is time for a lunch break. I would like to inform you that the lunch break is until 1:30 p.m., and it will be a great pleasure to have you return to this room on time. Thank you.
Yes.